single experience that changed the direction of your life? Well, this is what's happened to our speaker, Keith York. He was busy spending many days at San Diego State University, where he was working with KPBS as a programmer and producer for TV content, as well as lecturing at the School of Communications. He decided he wanted to live closer to work. So he hopped on his bicycle and rode around the college residential area and was incredibly taken with a house that he saw that was designed by mid-century modern architect Craig Elwood. That was the only house that Craig Elwood designed in San Diego. Keith was able to buy the property in the year 2000, and while he was doing his research on the history and working on renovations, he developed a passion for mid-century, for post-World War II modernist art, architecture, and design. And Keith has carried this passion and knowledge ever since that time, and his desire is to share all of this with all of us so that we can appreciate this area of design and art and architecture. Some of you may know this. Keith created the website modernsandiego.com, which is the resource for mid-century modern architects in the San Diego region. He also sends out a monthly newsletter, email, which keeps everyone up to date on what's happening in this world. Keith has created exhibits. He had curated gallery exhibits, written catalogs, and been a lecturer at many locations. One of them was at San Diego Public Library downtown, where he also did a gallery exhibit, as well as the Historical Society. And that's just a couple of many places he's enlightened us about mid-century modern architects, including Sir Bruce Richards. His most recent, I think it's the most recent, was his speech at their lecture at the Palm Springs Modernism Week. And he spoke about Julius Schulman, who is highly, highly regarded photographer of modernism. With all of this that he has done in this field, he has gotten to know many of these architects and certainly the families. Keith lives in a Sir Bruce Richards house designed by Sir Bruce Richards and is working on a book about Sir Bruce Richards. In addition to all this, he's a realtor, and his specialty is architect designed properties. We are in for a real treat today to learn more about Sir Bruce Richards, acclaimed artist and architect. So please welcome Keith York.
Why, thank you. It's kind of humbling to be here in front of you all in a historic place and a historic club and a historic group. So thank you all for welcoming me to your space. There's a gentleman named Sir Bruce Richards that I've become fond of. His family is here, so I feel like I'm on my toes. They will probably be at least mentally correcting me and my grammar in the forthcoming minutes. The key question, and thank you, Susan, for your introduction, is how I landed here. And that's as much part of my story as it is his story. How we get to places is really our story collectively, right? How you're all here, why you're all in San Diego, this room, etc. So as Susan mentioned, I bought a house in 2000 that it broke the internet at one point. The photos that my friend Darren took in the upper left made people dream about buying or living in the home that I lived in. And yet, not knowing where the future would lead me, in 2002, 2003, I met Janet Richards, who was living in a home her husband had designed. He had passed in 1983. And in surveying the neighborhood, asking for people to participate in a home tour for the Save Our Heritage organization, she welcomed me into her front door, into her living room, and I knew nothing at that moment of why I would even be here today. She told me about her late husband. She told me about the family members present in this room with us today. and she walked me through this magical home that I now own, right? That's the longer story short. But during that time with Janet, who admittedly I was in a bit awe of, and the history that she represented, she welcomed me in so graciously that I could come back, right? And she made me a hell of a tuna sandwich, I'll just say that. And I did come back. I came back so frequently, her son, who's in this room, sat me down at a local establishment, wanted to know the ins and outs of why I was visiting with his mom so frequently. And Cammie, I owe you a debt of gratitude for filtering me out from the riffraff that probably was trying to have Janet serve tuna sandwiches to them as well. One of the things that Janet told me during that initial visit, and what became a succession of many, many visits until her passing in 2017, was this connection that her late husband, Sim Bruce Richards, had with Frank Lloyd Wright. And I presume everyone in this room knows that name, right? Everyone seems to, even 5-year-olds in elementary school seem to know Frank Lloyd Wright equals architect, or vice versa. And so I got to understand through a lens of Frank Lloyd Wright who Bruce Richards was. And so I, in 2015, put an exhibition together for the La Jolla Historical Society called Frank Lloyd Wright's Legacy in San Diego, a key component of which is also what I'm going to talk about today. And then in 2017, shortly after their mom's passing, the Richards family offered me the opportunity to purchase the family home that I had come to know through sifting through the musty, dusty materials in their damp basement, still damp to this day, and seat myself at a table where Janet had served me those wonderful tuna sandwiches. The story is quite interesting, though. I have, and I said this to the folks at my table earlier, I've talked about Bruce Richards a number of times. I've shown pictures of his houses many times. And the more often I'm invited to speak to him, I feel like I need to pull one more layer of the onion down to its core. And the core is this harrowing journey from Georgia to Oklahoma that his forebears, including his grandmother, pictured here, they were ushered by the U.S. government from a Cherokee land that they had long established as and called home, to one quite foreign to them and a bit more forbidding and foreboding in Oklahoma. I think of the term the Dust Bowl. Many of you have heard that term, and I try to conjure up Grapes of Wrath, Citizen Kane, and all these kinds of long ago stories of old or early Americana, right? I don't know firsthand what that looked like, but the more I think about Bruce's ancestry, I think about this just crazy place that Oklahoma was in this rural, hot, dry landscape. But ultimately, another generation comes forward. This is his grandmother's mom, Mabel, and his dad, Sim Bruce Richards, #1. So often people ask me or tell me, I was at home just this last weekend and they called him Sims, or Bruce Sims, or Richards Bruce Sims, and the names are all kind of jumbled. And in a little bit of Wikipedia entry, right, I can find that Sim was a common first name for many people years and years and years ago. I don't find anyone that I've come across in my adult life that has that name, but it was fairly common. So Sim Sr., in this case Sim the First, they had a little baby. I'll just say that, right? And one of my favorite things about Bruce, because I only understand him as an adult man, a practitioner of this fascinating career architecture, is he was also just a little boy at one point, right? And in front of the family home, the neighbors gathering, a bunch of little kids, reminds me of how these immigrants, these expats from the Cherokee Nation were reestablished in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and yet they just look like the Little Rascals, don't they? They look like, kids of yesteryear, and they were, right? They jumped and screamed and played, and that was sort of the rambunctious gang of Central Avenue in Tahlequah. And then these are the homes of his earliest experiences that he wrote about later. There was a moment where, in Janet's basement, going through stacks of papers and files and folders, I came across about 24 handwritten pages that were his autobiography in progress at the time of his passing. And he mentions homes like this that were his earliest memory that would be evoked later in the home I live in and others around San Diego County. But if you look at this home, it probably reads like a Mission Hills, sort of craftsman era, early 20th century home, because it is true that these homes, like in Mission Hills, they were sporadically peppered throughout the landscape because that was the architecture of the early 20th century. That was the vocabulary of those practitioners. But homes like this in Tahlequah were rarer, and he kept that in mind and wrote about them years later. The young boy became a sick 12-year-old. There is some mythology around this. His family probably knows more the fact than the myth. But when I met people that knew Bruce, they would tell me the story, right? And it is a story that he chewed on hay as a young boy. And you can kind of get that Little Rascals image, right? These little black and white films that are comedic, that the boy's got, well, like Alfalfa, or one of those characters has a little, straw of hay sticking out of his mouth. And one of those seeds got caught in his gum line, and it festered, and it became toxic. And ultimately, if that's the myth or the truth, the lion's share of, the story is that he lost a big chunk of his jaw. And this little poor boy in this early 20th century wheelchair is of my mind and on my mind a lot more than the cedar that will normally become synonymous with Richard's adult life, right? He comes from a place that ultimately builds a unique architecture. So that's why I wanted to kind of walk you through this early life. Here he is with Melody Morris, who becomes quite famous in the hand-looming rug world. Now, again, work with me, right? That's a small cadre of people in the 20th century, but people that collect hand-loomed rugs and early textiles know her work. There is not very much of it out there, and it is collectible to a place where people are seeking out her work. But she taught this young man this craft. And so again, this is not a normal upbringing. Like the stories that he's telling as a youth and the experiences he's having as a youth are quite different. He goes to Berkeley. These are just a couple of a myriad of images I've become intoxicated with over the years. Thankfully, Bruce and his friends took pictures of each other, so I have some sense of the place they lived in, the clothes they wore. Bruce, and the image to the left is the one at the easel painting, and his roommates are in the foreground taking the same art class he was taking. For a short time, he was dating this young woman, Lucretia Tweak Nelson. So that's one of the few, I think I have 2 or 3 pictures of him and this short-lived girlfriend. It was college, right? They wrote letters to each other, and they were well fascinated about the world around them as well as getting to know one another. The Depression was looming. The things that they were doing to get by, to pay their rent, were fun and interesting as a historian, but they were, I'm sure, very difficult at the time. He and their friend Blaine would go to, at least the story goes, right? They'd go to secondhand stores and buy things like bathrobes and rip them into shreds and hand connect them into fascinating tapestries and rugs that were of abstract design, and they would be able to sell these, perhaps. In his own words, they waited in line to get like distilled alcohol that was being served in mayonnaise jars or whatever. The life they were leaving was trading and bartering, and ultimately they were serving as the building supervisor for their apartment building to get a reduction in rent. And all the while I was just mindful of how expensive and wonderfully robust Berkeley, California is today, and quite different at the time they were in college. Again, there's a lot of mythology about how he meets Frank Lloyd Wright, and the stories are probably too numerous for me to actually tell you all of them, but suffice to say, one of those hooked rugs that were made out of found materials and possibly discarded bathrobes found its way into a storefront in San Francisco, supposedly at the exact time where Frank Lloyd Wright is in San Francisco visiting a client and possibly giving a lecture, and he sees them. He just witnesses them. And the serendipity of this moment to put someone's life on a different trajectory was initially very hard for me to believe. I'll just say that candidly, right? It seems that all these things have to align, but the world was smaller then, right? And so to be a famous architect strolling the avenues of downtown San Francisco to see this storefront with this unique abstract storefront display would have brought him to study under the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. And here with his sort of fellow student class at Taliesin, young Bruce is on the left. And I've been able to figure out over the years sort of who these people are possibly. I do need to probably collaborate with the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation because some of the photography that Bruce had in his possession, or Janet, when I visited, still had in her possession, are not very well annotated. Well, they're not annotated at all, I'll just say that, right? So he's with Bruce, he's with Frank Lloyd Wright and this cadre of young budding architects, all coming from different walks of life around the country. And in 1936, he sort of graduates, if you will. He leaves or departs the study of Frank Lloyd Wright, and he starts trying to figure out his own way. And that's one of the most interesting things I've come across is not from a pedigreed family or a well-heeled family in a generous suburb. He was in Phoenix in the 30s, right? So again, this sort of Dust Bowl-esque kind of theme. And he starts doing interior design and furniture design. And he could get a commission from the Arizona Teachers College, which really becomes Arizona State through a number of machinations. But he's doing what I would say are very, very contemporary designs for the 1930s. He's not following the trends of existing sort of heavy, thick wooded furniture from the East Coast. He's designing his own path in such a way that the Arizona Teachers College has him design these quite insane, just to be generous with my tone, murals, very large scale, for an artist that does not have a proven legacy or a proven set of shows or exhibitions or catalogs under his belt. And here he is, 2 people away from the dancer Martha Graham, who is pictured in one of the murals. The murals decorated the women's sort of auditorium, and it was where dance was taught at the Arizona Teachers College in the 30s. And so as a young man, so at this point he's 31, 30-ish years old of age, depending on the date of the picture, and his last birthday. As a young man, he is with singularly one of the most important people in visual and performing arts of the 20th century. So things seem to happen so quickly for him. He's touching greatness. He's surrounded by greatness at such an early age. I honestly had to pull back a number of times and go, is this real? Like, is this actually this little house in this basement in Point Loma with a great tuna fish sandwich? Like, is that really what I'm doing as I'm rifling through someone else's papers? The next year, he has a one-man show that is not very well documented, but I have a couple of threads to which, thankfully, other people have written books about arts in Arizona and the WPA movement in the southwestern United States that have helped me stitch together some of the fabric that is his early art career. But about 1940 is also the time when he heads to San Diego. Part of the reason he heads to San Diego is there's work in San Diego. There's a war breaking out, unfortunately. And so the wartime effort draws Bruce to San Diego to work in the U.S. Navy. It's not exciting work, but what is exciting is he meets Janet. And Janet, who was, again, as I've said several times, my host over the several years of getting to know the story, captivating woman. In her own right, I could have easily switched gears and just did slides on Janet and her life. Their life together was very productive, fraught with all kinds of economic hard times because of the era in which they are trying to become professionals. They became adults, and certainly they raised a family of 3 kids. being an architect is not as lucrative as one might think of a profession. So the stuff that I've heard, the fabric of this family that have been shared with me is nothing short of sort of love and music and art, keeping it together through thick and thin and good and hard times. But what most people think about is the guy who was an architect. Right? That's sort of the headline. Right? Oh, he was an architect and he did these really fun and unique houses. To get to this first photo of one of his houses, I wanted to just at least lay the groundwork. This is not an ordinary story. This is not, oh, he went to this high school, he went to this college, he got a bachelor's of architecture degree. I've said this before in front of audiences. Then they got their exam and they got a license to practice, and behold, all these wonderful pictures, right? This is a guy that is, from the beginning, from prior to his birth to get to this first photo, is going in a very, very different path. So his first house is at least the first documented house in San Diego County. Okay, there are projects that I would have to talk your ear off of, and I don't want to. This is a house he did. He was commissioned by his mother and his stepfather, or father-in-law. Okay, how you word that. The man that his mom remarried. Right? This is in Point Loma, and the owner of this house came to me. He had heard a rumor around his street that his house was by Bruce Richards, and I was able to tell with this photo and a couple of other pieces of information that in fact I think it's the first house. This is 1942. He's not licensed. He's still working for the Navy. He is not supposed to be designing houses, and houses generally are not being built during the war, right? So there's some issues and some factual stuff that needs to come together to validate that, but this is what I think to be his first project. And note, what I'll get into in a minute is that the horizontality of it. It's a very horizontal house. People like to say, oh, that's a one-story house. But even one-story houses undulate and move along with their terrain. But horizontality is actually this really fascinating thing in architecture. And then one of the fun things that happens is through scouring through Bruce's musty basement, is I find this drawing that was published in the San Diego Union at the time, is this would have been his first house under the guise of, excuse me, working for this firm, Johnson and Abrams. You may have heard the name William Templeton Johnson. He was kind of an architect about town in San Diego, but Bruce was his junior employee. It's a short-lived employment. He is itching, I think, to get out on his own, to prove himself, to do something bold and unique. And one of the things he does is he builds the family's first house. This is designed in 47 and executed in 48. And it goes through a series of owners' hands and changes a little bit over the years. But it looks so crazy when you look at the automobile that this was a house not of the last, say, decade, but many, many decades ago. The house sticks out like a sore thumb on a busy corner, on a busy street, and yet it defines its own vocabulary. It is when I think of the word architecture, it's distilling all kinds of things, and yet it's a house. And you can see, that's him right there. Right. I don't know if this is the family car or this is someone else's car. Maybe a family member knows. No one knows. It's not important. But what I love about architectural photography is when there's a car present or something like a mode of dress that you can say, if that was in fashion when that house was built, then that house stands to be more unique, right? Here's the Soleil house of 1949, again in Point Loma. Again, very horizontal. Part of him changing his vocabulary is he's in horizontal boarding. These stripes of the exterior facade, the boarding, is very horizontal. It's very Frank Lloyd Wright vocabulary to have the house feel like it's hugging the ground, feeling like it's part of its site. And verticality changes the dynamic where you're rising up from the site, right? So he was trying to figure out his own vocabulary. And before we get into the 1950s, I still don't understand what this is. Like, this is not horizontality, it's not verticality, it's stitch work, right? It's the most amazing facade I've ever seen in San Diego architecture. It reads like nothing that has ever come before or since. The house has unfortunately been remodeled, but this photograph is the only example I have of him saying, hey, I may be just a lowly building designer in my little La Jolla office, and this is about his 4th project, but he's willing to go out on a limb creatively, right, and really show that he is he's up to something. I'll just say that. And then we enter the 1950s. Bruce starts using the Mayan symbol for the house as his business card, his emblem. He puts this on his blueprints. He becomes very fond of Mayan history, especially regarding its calendars, its culture, its language, its written language, and certainly to some degree its architecture. And he builds the second house for his family. I found that the houses that an architect does for his or her own family demonstrate a number of things, that they're either using them as laboratories to experiment, or they're trying to get away with something that none of their clients will actually pay them to do. And now that I get to live in one of his houses, I am often asked by people that come in, like, well, what's the story with your house? And I go, well, it's kind of a hodgepodge of all the things he was doing at the time, but his first 2 houses were laboratories, for sure. They looked very different from everything around him. Oh, by the way, excuse me, this Torrey pine is now about 80 feet tall. It is commanding its corner site. But I find it so funny that Janet reportedly, put this in the ground as maybe a 1 or a 5-gallon plant, circa 1953-ish, and it is now part of it is my neighborhood, right? You can see it from Shelter Island, for what it's worth. His interiors become, I feel, dynamic in photographs, but over the course of looking and visiting a number of his houses, there are some templates, right? There are often cedar and oak floors, there are often mahogany walls, and there are often incense, or what people termed pencil cedar. When you used to break open a pencil as a kid and you could see that shiny wood inside, that wood coming from the Pacific Northwest became sort of like how his interiors sort of became similar, and his clients that would visit one would want him to do another for them. So we see up here, we see light fixtures, right? One of his Cherokee connections are these quiver-like beam tails or roof rafter tails. We definitely, throughout visiting all of his homes, lots of the hardware are very unique to his own houses. He wasn't buying off-the-shelf hardware. And these are the furnishings of the day. Right? These are not contemporary furniture other than they were available, but they weren't like high design. So you see lots of creature comforts in his homes, and lots of rugs and lots of carpeting, magazines on the table. They were homes that were very much always lived in. So he wasn't also out on the edge with crazy clients that wanted to live austere life in sort of glass and steel boxes, as we often see some of the photography of the era. This is the Silva House, also in Point Loma. Again, you'll see how he would decorate these rafter tails or the tips of the beams. Wide expanses of glass, a generous use of certainly wood, and you can see the brick fireplace inside this glass. He would talk to his clients at length about the natural materials, right? Now, obviously bricks are man-made, but they come from the soil, right? He was always sharing with clients that sort of just from a health standpoint, from an aesthetic standpoint, how could you build a house of man-made materials like plastic and steel? How could you put these man-made artifacts into your home and invite guests over? This house had a pigskin leather floor. I mean, how much more natural can you get than animal? And there's lots and lots of these stories. I'm glad you find that humorous. I could go humorous the whole trajectory of my talk, because there is a great deal of whimsy. There's a great deal of comedy. There's always a can of beer and a cigarette nearby as he would tell jokes and tell stories, some of which I've heard people tell me weren't necessarily true, but he just enjoyed telling that story, so he kept telling that story. Again, interiors, the same hardware, the same drawer pulls. We're seeing lots of the cedar decking here, the Douglas fir beam. All these things become, for me, having witnessed so many of his houses, sort of standardized detailing. But for the time and for the magazines that would write up his houses and share these photographs with readers, they were actually doing something quite unique. There was something different. When people don't know his architecture, if I talk to somebody in another state that has never been to my house, for example, I just say, contemporary cabin, right? Think cabin. Everyone's been to a cabin on a lake in the woods, and it's always much more comfortable, right? When you go to someone else's cabin or you go to a ski lodge, there's some sort of hugging, the house giving you a gentle pat on the back and a warm embrace. And I've found that in the contemporary architectural setting, his career, he was embracing people. He was giving people a sense of comfort that was left behind in the Craftsman era, like the houses in Mission Hills that I mentioned earlier. Having spoken to one of his still living employees or colleagues, Tony Ciani mentioned to me that he was the last living link to the Craftsman era. And if you leave with anything today, I think that's the takeaway, right? Is in the 50s and the 60s, all the way through the early 80s, he was still holding on to Craftsman idealism and the use of natural materials and the home as an entire hearth, right? Not just in front of the fireplace, but the whole home was a hearth that I've been calling them contemporary cabins. Don't quote me on that because his family would not be pleased with me saying that. But it is very much, I feel like, the generous nature of what a cabin did for me when I was a child. My parents took me up to, say, Big Bear or Lake Arrowhead for a weekend of camping and fishing. And I remember not what the total house looked like, but I remember that feeling of being sort of in a getaway, on a weekend with a family. Bruce pulled some interesting strings on a number of his houses. These crazy light fixtures are one of the earnestly, I mean this sincerely, like crazy light fixture, the weirdest thing I've ever seen, right? I've been to this house, what's even actually left of it today, and they were still there were still light bulbs in them, they were still functioning, but they're mounted on this, I mean, that is a structural beam, but that does not look like any other structural beam I've seen any other architect use, and certainly that he ever deployed on any of his other houses. The photographer that's taking this picture is basically standing in the San Diego Harbor. This house is right on the coast of Coronado looking towards downtown. For an admiral, right? There's always a connection to the Navy. And this is certainly one of his, this is Admiral Horde. And this is for an auto dealer in Escondido, right? This is the Guy Pito residence up in sort of Vista area. So he did houses for, all kinds of people, all different walks of life. I think one of his sweet spots was when there was a lower wage earning public school teacher that really wanted to live in one of his houses, that he would cut costs in every measure to meet their needs or their budget. But this was definitely an extravagant, large home for a successful auto dealer in North County. Again, you'll see the flare of the beam tip kind of rise to the sky. The house was heavily photographed and published at its time. Bruce may have been a modest man, but the photography of his houses ended up speaking to the masses, right? That he was fairly well published throughout his career. One of the things that somewhat comes to mind is, and I've been trying to come up with an accurate count. People say, how many buildings did he do? Which is really not an important measure of anyone's life. It's a little north of 200 projects, some of which were not built. How many commercial or non-residential projects he did is probably around 8, right? I'm still counting, but information continues to arrive to me that there's, someone else says, oh, I know where something is that you don't know about. But then here's Bruce in the mid-60s with what became the Mission Bay Aquatic Center. I don't know if any of you have ever been on that weird cul-de-sac on Quivira Basin When you kind of leave Mission Beach, you left the roller coaster behind and you make a series of right turns and you loop around. And there's this ostensibly a lifeguard storage and sort of meeting space, and where they punch the clock to go off to their lifeguard duties for the day. But it is, as I've been told, the only working fireplace in a civic building in San Diego County that is run municipally, right? Like, he had to deploy the hearth. He had to keep these lifeguards feeling comfortable and cozy, even in what is ostensibly a municipal building. He toyed with roof lines a lot. This probably doesn't really, you probably don't respond to roof lines the way I do, and I get that, right? But imagine that, you know, if you're just like here for lunch and you're watching me talk, you're like, oh, yeah, there's a flat roof on a lot of commercial buildings, right? Like the grocery store you have probably has a flat roof. And then in your home, it probably has a pitched roof. And then where it snows, they're really pitched, right? So the snow falls off. Well, what is this then? You explain that to me, right? The folded plate roof only happens in Southern California because snow would get caught in that crevice, that little canyon in the fold, right? This is the Rigsby House, one of my favorite houses in all of the county by Bruce. It's in Point Loma, partially because of that crazy roof line. He went through a number of iterations. The butterfly roof, which just is an inverted, roof, it's a V, and then here we have a series of folds. And I get drawn into these photographs. I've said this many times, but yet today, one of the things is I'm not an architect. I've never been trained in architecture. I've never studied architecture like you. I've maybe used the word in a couple of sentences with a lowercase a. Right? I don't know architecture. But what I know is when it's captured in a wonderful photograph, I go, wow, who gets to live there? And who are they? And why not me? My friends now own this house, so I get to visit it. And it's just the most amazing space. That they are the woman's an artist, the owner is an artist, and she gets to joyously live and experience and conduct her craft, right, from this home. I'll just point out a couple things, right? There's a Jim Hubble chandelier. All of these are hand-turned by Jim Hubble, the artist in San Isabel. This whole banister is a carved piece of wood. This fireplace, right, is this insanely large. It's like the mouth of a shark or a whale opening up, and you feel drawn in. You could fit, a small Volkswagen Bug in there probably. But again, it's like you see the natural materials. You see the wood. You see the sun coming in through the glass. You see the double height fireplace, the masonry. But part of that is this vantage point by the photographer, who was, coincidentally, a Bruce Richards client himself. Right? So he not only is taking pictures of Bruce's work, but he's living in a home that Bruce built for him. Part of me thinks there was probably some finagling there. I'll take some photos for you. You'll build me a house for a little discount. And they worked together collaboratively. This was for Dr. Lloyd, Engstrand. I don't know if any of you know Iris Engstrand. Right, so her previous husband commissioned Bruce prior to their marriage. This house is in Mount Helix. And then we get to another interesting character, Larry or Dr. Lawrence Fine, still living, still in this house. And as the 60s are progressing, Bruce's clients are progressing financially. He is progressing as a designer, and his partnership with the artist Jim Hubble is progressing exponentially. And so some of the houses start maturing well past sort of cabin architecture that I might have mentioned earlier 100 times. This entryway is very much the zenith of where Bruce saw his career headed, incorporating artists in the design of a house structurally. Not putting a painting on a wall by an artist, but the artist actually helping craft the space. So the stained glass windows around the hand-wrought door. So if you look closely, this is all a design by Jim. You can see the light fixture over the formal dining room is by Jim. There are structural beams of this banister holding up this little, almost gate to the formal dining room. You're seeing hand in glove an artist and an architect collaborating. There are a number of examples like this. This photo just, I felt, read pretty well for you as an audience to see maybe for the first time where an artist and an architect working together to collaborate space is vastly different, very different from having an architect do a space and then an artist, oh, I bought a sculpture at a sculpture dealer and I put it in my home. Like, that's wildly different than the home actually being a work of sculpture. As the 70s progress, part of Bruce's career starts, I think, hitting this interesting zenith again of the recession, right, home building, and the peak of his artistic abilities, right? So we see in the Lion House in Escondido, really these sculpted structural beams, this sort of ode to Moroccan and Spanish architecture, these really unique patio doors. But these are not sculpture that Nancy Lyon bought and brought into her home. Her house reads as a sculpture court on the inside, on the interior. And the 70s also become another couple of opportunities for him to do commercial architecture and work in Adobe. I don't know how many of you have given any thought to Adobe architecture, but it works well and almost exclusively in the Southwest. And here is a commercial building. It's been destroyed. It was on 5th. I always think about the way you drive. 4th. I think it's 4th. Yes. So you're driving south, and this used to be a one-story commercial building on a site in that real estate zone, right? You can imagine how its lifespan was numbered from the get-go. It looks pretty southwesty, right? You can see this in Taos, you can see it in Santa Fe, maybe Tucson, maybe San Diego. But when you open the door to the psychologist's office, ladies and gentlemen, this is the interior. And again, I could say this is all Jim Hubble, but I want to say this is the collaborative nature of a very unique partnership. You do not see, I could go so far as to say anywhere in the world, right? There are lots of religious structures that have incorporated the art and the artistry together, the architecture, from the beginnings of how do you design where congregants sit and what do they look to their congregational or religious leader at some sort of dais, right? But this is, and I want to say this again, a psychologist's office, right? Like, what is the relationship between practitioner and patient, visitor and, I mean, the administrator, perhaps like a receptionist, right? The decking, the courtyard around this entry point was also sculpted, right? Rhoda Lopez, a local ceramist, did a fountain as you entered this door. And I just can't imagine the conversations you have with Dr. Larry Fine about your personal concerns while this is the end. And I don't know if any of the family members went here, but it reads very wonderfully through photography, right? And then as we get to the end of his life, and I'm pressed for time, is this house he does for Harvey Fergatch on the coast of Del Mar. I mean, if the house were for sale now, it would be $20 million. It's literally on the sand. And it's not very well photographed. So I just wanted to at least give you a moment to say, hey, this is a great photograph, but Keith's going to explain why, right? But what we have is this long lot to ocean, and you can see the glass is actually opening. As you walk to the front door, you see the ocean, right? You see through that glass panel to the ocean. Here he's got landscaper Frank Kogi, he's got ceramist Rhoda Lopez, he's got artist, sculptor Jim Hubble, all working together on a vast parcel of land by Harvey Fergatch, who then was a land developer. You may not know this name, but he was in the Union Tribune. Now, a lot of people liked him because he was a developer, and a lot of people loved him because he was a developer, right? One of the things that he did was he collected Native American pottery, and Bruce had to kind of create exhibition spaces for this Native American pottery. And there's nods to his time with Frank Lloyd Wright, not the least of which is Harvey Fergatch was one of the very few people ever in San Diego history to actually hire Frank Lloyd Wright to design a house in Spring Valley that was never built. So Harvey has this moment with Frank Lloyd Wright in the 50s, and then ultimately hires Bruce in the early 80s to design this fantastic spread. It's not even a house, it's almost like a hotel. It's so exquisite in its grounds and how it meets the ocean, certainly. But I wanted to just kind of like, leave it there. There's a moment where it comes full circle, that he hires a client of Frank Lloyd Wright's. So in my last few slides, what I wanted to kind of address are what are very typical Bruce Richards houses, right? This is like this question I get all the time. Like, what do I know when I see a Bruce Richards house? How do I know it's a Bruce Richards? Is there like a telltale sign? And so just bear with me. This is a little cute, right? This is me being a little funny, right? Is garages, fences, fireplaces, and more. He likes garage doors, right? So here's the Silva House garage door, right? This grid pattern, it reads very shoji screen, Japanese tea house, right? But he doesn't just use it once, he continues to use variations of the theme of the interior shoji screen as a way of better defining the garage door. I mean, I could say this, hands up, who hates a garage door, right? You drive through the neighborhoods of San Diego County, a garage door is the easiest thing to loathe, right? It's just fully functional, but never very pretty, right? And so I think Bruce starts putting his fingerprint. I'm always looking for the Bruce Richards fingerprint, the unique thing that is of his work, his mind, that you won't find on any other home. But he loved a good garage. He loved a good fence, a good sunscreen, and these grids. This material, this is how deep I go, right? So the material is not fiberglass. It's a product called alcinite. The reason I know that is because the alcinite factory was in Pacific Beach. It had a short run, and Bruce did these grids with this fiberglass-like material in a short span of time. And so you can find one-to-one relationships between he and a vendor, right? There's a supplier of something that I think it's very toxic if you lick it or put it in your mouth. The other thing that people often ask me about is the fireplaces. So the cool thing about Bruce Richards, may he rest in peace after all these years, right? Everyone seems to know that he had a thing for the fireplace. Every house has a fireplace. Some of his commercial buildings have a fireplace. The fireplace in photography is hands down never replicated, right? There is not two fireplaces. I've seen two that are similar, but there is not two fireplaces that look alike. So here's the big copper hood, right, and the middle of the room fireplace, which is sort of its own thing. I don't know how many of you have a fireplace, but it's generally not in the room. It's against a wall. So here he's putting it as a three-dimensional sculpture that you can walk around. That's the pigskin right there. If you look closely. There's lots of great angles. Here's a young nurse, Mrs. Karn in Ocean Beach. And I went to this house thinking it was a Bruce Richards house, but really, he basically did her fireplace. Like, he did this tiny little living room remodel for a woman that was on a fairly simple budget. It's a very small house. But this ends up getting him his photograph in the local paper, right? So there's articles, if you go back in time, which I do, fireplaces of great houses in San Diego County, and the Union or the Evening Tribune or the San Diego Home and Garden or San Diego Magazine will collect all these disparate houses. And here's the article on fireplaces. Here's the article on patios. Here's the article on kitchens. Here's the article on bathroom remodels. And this funny fireplace, because it's the most photogenic part of the whole house, right? Gets him some press. He liked these sort of half moon, half circle fireplaces. Again, the sort of slight angle is very Wrightian. In the sort of the teachings of Frank Lloyd Wright, one of the things that a lot of his apprentices walked away with was the hexagon as the perfect shape rather than a square or a rectangle for a building. And so you find these sort of 20 and 30 something degree angles throughout some of Bruce's work, as well as other architects that started studying with Frank Lloyd Wright. Here's a fireplace. Again, he did a remodel for a house. It's a fairly straightforward remodel, but this is by Rhoda Lopez, who at the time had a studio in North Park. and is one of the most amazing ceramists in San Diego history, and there has yet to be any real full acknowledgement of her place in the canon. And then here's how kind of many of his friends and family remember him, right? He was an older gentleman when he passed. He was living in a funky, cluttered office. This was in his La Jolla office. He transports much of this stuff to his final office in Old Town. And just the fabric of all this stuff around him reads sort of who I've come to understand this man as. It's not sparse. It's not like tubular steel European furniture, right? He's wearing a tie that sort of isn't really fully on his neck. And he's got kind of this funky beard that's sort of somewhat masquerading his absence of a full mandible, full chin. And there's just plants and sculpture and funky stuff. And I thought this photograph might just help, maybe as we end our formal program, right? Just to help you understand that his was not a normal life. His craft was not a normal trajectory, and his homes were not by any means consistent with anything that was going on at the time. And he was somehow holding on to this early 20th century aesthetic of the Craftsman era all the way until his passing and his last projects in 1982 and 83. And with that, I'm happy to address any question. I don't know if I've over-talked and you're like, oh my gosh. Or if you're like, hey, that reminds me, I have a question. But I'm happy to distill or connect any funny or unique dots that this man's life represents.
Right here, right. So in the Silva house, is the pigskin floor still there, or did it get replaced by?
Yes, replaced by ... I've been in touch with the last few owners and the architects and contractors they've hired. I don't know why, but people will call me and say, hey. And they end up destroying the thing that they called me about in the first place, right? So the pigskin, is, to my knowledge, that's the only place where it existed, right? And I think it was sockless, walking around the house, right? Like without your barefoot touching a leather floor would be a really intimate experience, I think. But that house, probably his archetypal best house of that period of his career, has been so remodeled that the next owner goes, oh, it's remodeled, I'll just keep remodeling it, right? So rather than going back to kind of curate its original intent, people just do a succession of another layer of remodeling. So yeah, I think the pigskin was gone 2 decades ago-ish on about the 3rd owner, probably. Yes?
Wonderful. It was really, really great. One of the things that I enjoyed the most was that you showed us the progression of his style and sort of his personality as he aged. And I loved the fact, I didn't realize that he was so close to Jim Hubble. And Hubble was a member of our club. So we are very familiar with Jim's work, and it was so great to see it in a new way. So thank you so much.
Thank you. In getting to know this work, one of my early interviews was with Jim Hubble. And this is 20 years ago. And without batting an eye, without pausing a second, he's like, I deserve everything I have because of Bruce Richards. And I'm like, no, that's a bit generous, right? You know, we often speak of people like that. That, you know, had this not happened, I would not be who I am. But in earnest, so Jim Hubble went to Cranbrook. He is a very accomplished creative thinker before he meets Bruce. But Bruce somehow takes him under a wing and introduces him around all these clients and says things like, you need Jim to do something in your house. A light fixture, a banister, a railing. And it's so odd, right? They were like compatriots in aesthetics, for sure. But I haven't witnessed the same like generosity. Their age is quite different, right? So this was a younger man that he was like, no, I want to see this man's career propelled, and so Bruce did everything he could. And we see that in Jim being a successful artist today. But Jim's like, no. This is not Cranbrook. This is not my own creativity. It was that man introducing me around, opening up doors, before I could put my work into these homes, he was hosting me. It's really profound. Yes.
Thank you very much. Also, I was a
Yeah.
I wondered if there are some homes that have a historic designation that remain the same as they were originally.
That's a great question. So for those that didn't hear, there are a number of Bruce Richards homes that are historically designated sites in the city of San Diego or the county. I'm working on the application for my own home, so I have those applications to sort of stand on, right, to leverage. So it is true that he is designated by the city and the county as a master architect. So homeowners tomorrow, years from now, can kind of connect their home to a master architect and get their homes designated as a historic site. The definition of historic site is always fluid. There is a house in Point Loma on San Antonio Avenue that had a second story put on it, and it was still historically designated as a Bruce Richards house because the second story reads like the first story. And I thought, well, that's broad definition of historic designation. Many of the homes that are historically designated are gutted on the interior. And as I showed you in pictures, the interior is crucial, critical even, to maintaining the integrity. But people live contemporary lives, they want contemporary things, so they keep the front facade facing the street in its original form. I'm a little nerdy, a little nuts, people have called me all kinds of words. We actually, with the help of the son, figured out the original stains that were used on the exterior of my house, and rather than painting it a color that mimics, we actually sanded down to wood and tried to reapply stain, right? So there's different levels of how people take historic designation. Yes?
Were the interior sculptures from the psychiatrist's office preserved?
That's a great question. So when the building sold, and I think Soho and the Union Tribune got involved, there was a little bit of publicity. Dr. Fine, still living, right? Still lives in a home that Bruce did for him in Mount Helix. He was able to take some of the fabric out. I think Jim Hubble got some of those items back. The Rhoda Lopez fountain is now at the Episcopal Church on Chatsworth and Catalina, All Souls, in the garden, right? So it's been preserved. It's a beautiful little fountain. But those monumental beams, those posts, I'm not quite sure where they or some of those light fixtures went off to. But there was an effort. There definitely was an effort to keep some of that. Yes?
Thank you so much. What is always what struck me about Bruce Richards' home is that it has a sausalito feel to it. And I always see the redwood as being so prominent in his homes. And I was wondering could you speak, I don't know if there's any connection with sausalito picked up on views from Richards.
So that's a great question. So if you've all been to Sausalito, you've sort of soaked in the unique fabric and feel that Sausalito has. I'll say the same of Big Sur and Carmel. There's places in California that I'm like, oh, you could put a Bruce Richards house here and it would feel at home, right? So the interesting thing you mentioned is where lumber was coming from to build Sausalito at the same time he was doing these houses is all being floated down in the Pacific Ocean and carted on rail cars down from Oregon and Washington down to California. So a lot of California architecture of the 40s, 50s, and 60s has this heavy use of woods that we no longer have access to. Philippine mahogany, right? The Philippines, no more mahogany, right? There's no more mahogany in the Philippines. I don't want to break it to you if any of you were like trying to start a mahogany farm in the Philippines. But the notion of all this wood being excavated forested from the Pacific Northwest and brought to Southern California from, say Sausalito, the greater Bay Area down to Southern California, is actually a time capsule. It happened very cheaply and effectively and efficiently for architects to build these kinds of homes. Bruce's time in Berkeley is the connection to Sausalito. He, as a young man, soaked up William Wurster's architecture, and like Bernard Maybeck's architecture. Like the architecture that was happening in the Bay Area was when he was in college. And just like we all have fondness for our college memories, those things ended up being in my living room, like structurally. Like that's why they look that way. So thank you for that great question.
I think that's it.